All right. Hello, everyone. My name's Kareem Merchant. I'm the creative specialist here at KeyShot. I'll be kicking us off today. Welcome to our Mastering KeyShot Techniques webinar on UV Unwrapping. I know UV Unwrapping can often be complicated and cause some frustrations and headaches, so I'm really excited to have Don Tuttle here today to give us all a deeper understanding of the subject. For those of you who have not had a chance to meet Don or sit in on one of his previous webinars, Don is our global training specialist. He handles all global training needs. And over the last year, he's taken the opportunity to deep dive into the world of UV unwrapping inside of KeyShot. I'm sure Don is going to give you a little bit more info on what he does here and how you can work with him in person. But I did want to do a little housekeeping before I turn things over to him. As some of you may know, in the last year or so, we've introduced a newly updated forum for our KeyShot community called Luminaries. Highly recommend checking out Luminaries if you get a chance. It's a great place to connect with the rest of the KeyShot community and get feedback on your work, as well as even get answers on questions you may be struggling with. We also have KeyShot challenges running regularly on the forum, generally help you practice your skills while you're earning points towards KeyShot products, such as full subscription licenses and even programs like Will Gibbons' Rendering Masterclass. It's also the main place to participate in our live betas, get info on upcoming features, and connect with other beta users in the process. Again, I highly recommend giving Luminaries a try. And if you want to get there quickly, I have a QR code you can scan up on this slide, or you can just simply jump over to your browser, type in KeyShot Luminaries, and it should be, if not the first, one of the first things to pop up on your Google search, and then just follow that link. Aside from Luminaries, another great way to get info on our latest released features is through our KeyShot 3D YouTube channel. We're regularly posting quick tips and tutorials of all our latest features, and it's the best place to go for tips and tricks that can help speed up your project workflows. We'll also post all our webinars here after airing live, as well as presentations from events like KeyShot World or IDC. On the subject of KeyShot World, just a quick plug for our upcoming KeyShot World Chicago. If you're in Chicago mid-October, we have two in-person events happening. KeyShot World on the 18th, which will be a half-day event. Tickets are on sale for $99, and our one and only Don Tuttle is going to be holding an animation workshop the following day on the 19th. Space is very limited for the training event, so if you're in the area and you're interested in attending either event, make sure to book your tickets right away. Again, I know I mentioned this a little earlier, the QA chat box. If you guys have questions during the presentation, feel free to pop your questions into that Q&A chat box. I'll be monitoring it through the presentation. We'll be going over some Q&A at the end, and I'll shoot questions over to Don once we get to that point. And with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Don Tuttle. Don, feel free to kick us off whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Kareem. I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Don Tuttle, Global Training Specialist at Luxion, the makers of KeyShot. I'm really excited to be here today because UV unwrapping is my most favorite thing in the world. I'm being sarcastic. If anything, I've done everything I could in my career to avoid UV unwrapping. And one of the reasons why I liked KeyShot and the triplanar and box mapping was always useful. But after becoming the training specialist, I realized that the one tool that I didn't use very much, I suddenly had to learn. So I dove into the UV unwrap tool inside of KeyShot about a year ago now, and it's taken almost as long for me to really figure out an optimal way to utilize the tool. And so that's what I really want to share with you all today. We're going to be going through the unwrapping process as well as talking about model inspection and tessellation. So we will cover more than just UV unwrap. We'll talk about the quick unwrap and then dive in deeper by adding seams and doing the simplified unwrapping. We'll set some direction guides, execute the unwrapping, look at the material and the textures afterwards, and then I'll cover some general guidelines that you can follow and then discuss some challenging geometry. Not all of it was necessarily challenging, but it's worth noting. So we always need to go through the definition of UV unwrapping. And essentially what we've got when we unwrap our UVs is we're projecting a 2D plane onto a 3D model. And you can kind of see here what the unwrapping is doing. So why is it important? Well, a lot of the users with KeyShot are generally working with CAD, and CAD doesn't contain UVs. And that's why when we bring them into KeyShot and start working with the tessellated CAD, uh, and we want to have our UVs laid out for our textures, we've got to talk about some of that tessellation because it's really going to help us define where the seams are. So we'll be going through and retessellating the model, and we'll do a quick unwrap just to show the simplicity behind it. We'll set up some direction guides and seams here. To begin, we're going to be looking at the tessellation, and I'll talk about NURBs as we bring them in. We'll look over the model, and then we'll adjust some tessellation quality, and I'll talk about optimal tessellation. From there, we'll get into the edge length and talk about how we can utilize the edge length to create some nice symmetry with our triangles there, and then get into the quick unwrap and talk about those limitations. So I'm going to go ahead and get started now. Take a few steps back, hop over to KeyShot, open up my model library, and I've got a helix model here. Select OK. And let's begin by talking a little bit about the retessellate tool. You'll notice here we've got a NURBS helix. And if I select position, snap to ground, it doesn't snap to ground right away. So let's go to the properties and figure out why it's not snapping the ground. You'll notice when we have our part selected and we're underneath the properties, down at the bottom, you'll see that we've got a tessellation drop down. And then you'll see retessellate and always render as NURBS. If I uncheck that, the model disappears. And I mentioned a moment ago that NURBS don't contain those UVs. When we import the NURBS inside a KeyShot to view them, we can think of this model here as being a reference. It does consist of triangles, but they're NURBS based. So when we go to unwrap, we need to make sure that the model is complete polygons. So I'm going to select the retessellate. And when we first apply that tessellation, it's going to keep the tessellation that we use to import the file. So we don't need to worry about these particular settings right now. I'm going to select apply and done. And now when we uncheck always render NURBS, you can see here that it no longer disappears. And when we change the position, I can now snap to ground and center. The reason why it wasn't doing that with the NURBS is because sometimes there's construction planes that we don't see with the NURBS, and those were likely keeping it from snapping the ground. So let's go ahead and inspect the model. Since we've got our polygons here, I'm going to zoom in on there. You can see that we've got some faceting there, right? And we want to smooth that out a little bit. So this is where I'm going to go and adjust the tessellation by selecting the retessellate tool. Go ahead and open that up. A great setting to start with is about 0.3. So I'll select that and then scope out the triangles there. And you can see there's some faceting. So I'll turn that up to about 0.35. And it's a little bit smoother. I do want to point out the end here, however, not the best layout for UVs, or not the best triangle layout, I should say, for UVs. So what we can do here, and I'll explain why it's not a good layout here in a moment, but we want to adjust the maximum edge length. And really, I think about 1% is going to be sufficient, maybe a little much, but you can see just by adjusting that edge length, we now have some nice symmetry with our triangles. But the important part is having these straight lines inside there. If you remember a moment ago, we had a bunch of triangles just kind of crisscrossing everywhere. So we really want to have something like this, especially on a flat part. What this is going to allow us to do is set our direction easily. I also want to point out a few things about the triangles here. And looking at the vertices and how the lines are smooth, when I come around to the back, you'll notice that we've got these triangles here kind of going in an odd direction. So I'll look for pieces like that, something that really stands out in the model to give me a clue as to maybe placing a seam in this area of the model, and I'll explain seams in just a moment. But it's important to just kind of look at your model. Oftentimes, there's going to be maybe some stretching or artifacts inside of your UV charts. And this reminds me, if there's one big takeaway that I hope everybody understands here is UVs are never really perfect. You can sit there and work with them and massage them all day, to take a quote from a friend of mine. And they may not be up to par. They just may not fit with what you are looking for, but don't let that discourage you. There's techniques that we can use to hide these areas, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate some of those. Taking a step back, I wish I could provide tessellation settings that would be universal and always work, but every model is different, and every time I run through this tessellation setting, and during the practicing for this webinar, it looked different every time. So um, often we have to cross our fingers and hope that we did select the correct tessellation settings. And here I think we're going to be all right. So I'll select apply and done, and we can look at our model now. And I'll typically go into a top-down view and just kind of scope it out, make sure that we've got some nice rounds in there. One thing I forgot to mention a moment ago was the amount of triangles. You should keep pretty conservative. The denser your model is, the more of a chance you'll have like that stretching or those artifacts inside there. So we talked about using the quick unwrap, and so I'm going to show that real fast. Typically, what I'll do is start with a quick unwrap, and really what I've found is it only works well with flat parts, such as the end right here. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to duplicate this particular part. And to make our lives easier, when we're utilizing the quick unwrap, we can also separate these parts. So I've got the model selected there. I right clicked, go into tools, and I'm going to split object surfaces. So I'll select this flat piece here, as well as the helix portion. And now we've got two flat pieces and our helix. Great. I'll select apply. And now I'll select this model, or the flat portion here, right click, go to tools and unwrap UVs. And I mentioned a moment ago that using our quick unwrap for the unwrap shell works very well for parts that are flat, two-dimensional. So if we can imagine this circle here is in the center of an invisible square. All right, so really we're not having to unwrap anything because we already have our square, and that square will be represented by two triangles. So I'm going to select the part and then unwrap shell. And you can see here the chart, while tilted, is laid out pretty well. I'm going to first go in and let's go into a front view, and I'll use the grid to or the ground grid to line up our UV chart that we see here. So I'll just increase the size of that, and let's go to the back view. You'll notice that we've got a rotate in here. And really, like I mentioned before, some of these settings are always a little bit different to dial in. So I'm just going to put in some numbers that are relatively close. You can see here that we've got A4 to J4. And we can see that there's an edge right here. So often I'll try to get this square completely inside of that particular circle. Now, it doesn't have to be that large. Imagine if you wanted to have a repeating texture in there. We could then scale it down, and you can see where that texture will repeat by looking at the charts there. Scale it back up. And at this point, really want to remember these numbers. If you have another part, which we'll do in just a moment, we're going to want to use the same numbers here. That said, the rotate may be a positive number, but we'll see. And that's just dependent on the direction that your surface is facing. So I'm going to select apply. And so we can get a nice representation of what's going on. I'm going to add a 3D procedural mesh, and then change the mapping type to UVs. Go and scale the mesh up so we can really see how things are laying out here. And so that looks great. It's nice and flat. We got our little circles there on the side. I'm pleased. When we come down here, however, we can see that this particular surface also needs to be unwrapped. So I'll select it, right click, go to unwrap UVs. And I mentioned before, quick unwrap is great for surfaces like this. And often I will start here every single time, but I want to show a different example now. When we retessellated the model, remember that we wanted to have these nice straight lines here, and that's for our direction guide. It's going to be right over here on the left. So I'm going to select the direction guide there. And when we're setting up the direction guide, our first vertice that we select is going to almost denote the direction, or should I say the second one. So if I start from the bottom and then select a vertice up top, that's telling KeyShot to unwrap the UV chart there in the proper direction. If you remember before, when we did the quick unwrap, we had to rotate it afterwards. So with it facing up now, if you ever make a mistake like that, we've got a nice tool that we can select to cancel and then complete it. So all we need to do here for this particular part is denote the direction. Then selecting the part, you'll see that it changes into this kind of beigeish tan color, and that lets us know that it's ready for the unwrap. So I'll select unwrap there, and now you can see that we no longer have to rotate the map. And then if you remember before, I said we need to remember what the scale was, and then that's 0.1. So by placing in the direction guide, we don't have to worry about that rotation, and everything should be good. So I'll select apply. And now we have the same layout on the ends there. Now we're going to jump into the helix spiral itself, but I'm going to make it a little difficult in that I'm not going to separate this particular helix spiral. And here I'm creating another model. Let's hide these parts. There we go. All right. So I'm going to right click, and this model is solid. It's all together. Now imagine if we were keeping this model all together like we are, we're going to want to add seams to those parts that we separated earlier. The reason why is those seams are going to help us denote how to unwrap the model. And when we're unwrapping it, again, you got to think of it as we're taking these triangles and we're flattening them out. We already know that these parts here can be separated on their own. So I'm going to add the seam there, and I'll typically just look for that area that looked odd to me previously. So I'm going to start my seam right here, and then skipping the second vertex, I'm going to go to the third, and you'll see now that we've got this dashed line that completes the seam. We can double click it if we're pleased with that, and then it's all the way around and completed. Then we can select the apply seam check mark there. And so we have our first seam set. Now let's add that direction guide like we did previously. So I'm going to go down here, set direction guide, and again, clicking on the bottom vertex, and then this top vertex is going to tell KeyShot what direction the field or the UV chart should go. So I'll select apply. Next up, we want to add a seam to the helix. You may have remembered that I mentioned earlier that we're looking for these areas that kind of stand out to place the seam. But not only that, as I mentioned before, UV unwrapping may not always be perfect, right? So when we're placing our seams, we don't want to actually place them over an area of the texture that's going to be visible to the viewer. An example of this would be to have your logo right over the middle of a seam. You wouldn't want to do that. There may be some artifacts there. So we're fortunate that this area here is pretty much hidden in the back. We're going to want to hide these seams. And while it's not always the case, it's generally a good practice, because I can see as we go down on the helix, it will start to wrap around. But let's go back up, zoom in over here. I'm going to select add seam, but we're also going to use the seam as a direction guide. So I'm going to check the direction guide option below here. And then just as before, we've got to think about the direction that we want it to flow, right? So in our case, we're going to be flowing left to right. And this is important later on. If we need to add another direction guide, it must go in the same direction as the other direction guide. So I'm going to begin to add the seam by selecting the first vertex. I'll skip the second vertex and then go to the third. Skipping the vertices, just kind of a best practice of mine. Again, you can see now that we have that dashed line just as before, and it moves all the way down. We can see how it is following those triangles that were just a little bit different. So I'll double click there in order to complete the seam, and then apply it by selecting the green checkbox or the check mark. Go over here to the bottom, and we need to add our other seam as well as that direction guide there. So I'll select add seam. We're not using this one as a direction guide though. I'm going to select the side vertices, skip the second vertex, and then select the third. See that completion line? And this is kind of a hint. If the line itself, in some examples, goes off onto other vertices, you may want to cancel that and try another vertex again so you can get this nice smooth line there. So I'm going to double click the third vertex to complete the seam, and then apply it with the green check mark. And we're going to again add in that direction guide there and say okay. Now going back to that takeaway, it's not always perfect. We can, though, look at some of the areas and try to guess where we might see some stretching. Oftentimes, it may be right on the other side of where your seam is, or it could be in these areas where we've got these vertices not really aligning. And all of these are pretty much lined up very well. We can see how the lines are connecting with that side there. So I'll kind of go in and inspect it and see if they're all lining up. Again, this area is the area of concern, but since we have that directional guide here, I think we're gonna be okay. Oftentimes, we can look at it from a top view, and there might be a little stretching here. Now, don't think that you need to have your, direction guide flow all the way down. Much like this, we didn't go all the way to edge, right? You can place your guides in there, to where they're not flowing all the way. So we've got those selected. Now we can go in, select the individual parts there. And you'll note that we start out with that beige or tan color. And as we select more parts, the colors will change just to let us know. So at this point, we're about ready to go ahead and unwrap. I'll select the unwrap down here. And then we can see our flow there. Guys, remember that number from before? Was it 0.1? So I've typed in the 0.1. We can now zoom in and see the UV chart is aligned there. We don't have to select it or do any kind of rotation. I'm going to go down and scope out the bottom one here, and you'll see that it isn't as aligned as well as the one up at the top, but I think it's going to be okay for our uses. Not too concerned. Zooming out and looking at the helix itself, there is a little bit of a stretching there, right? Not perfect, but I'm not going to get too concerned about it because really it's fairly small. You may notice, however, though, the UV chart is rotated, and that's because we told it the bottom and top is going from left to right. So we will need to rotate this one, but it's really pretty simple. I think should just be 90 degrees. And notice nothing happened because we've got to select those regions. And notice the region number is over here on the left. And so it's not always evident that you have it selected because there isn't like a highlight. You really need to pay attention over here on the left-hand side to know that you have the proper region selected. So I'll select region number 2, which is the side. And now we should be able to rotate this 90 degrees. And we can see there now that it is facing in the right direction. I'm going to zoom in on the seam now. And you'll notice that the charts there, we really would want to have our chart aligned with the seam here. So I'm going to try to get the A9 lined up, and we can either use the scale or the base UV size. Changing the base UV size can sometimes affect the other parts of the model. And that's KeyShot's just trying to compensate for the size, kind of set things up for you. And again, this is not an exact science. We also have a scale here that we can adjust, and this is different from the base UV size. You'll notice as I increase the scale here on the side, the base UV for the other parts aren't changing. But if I put that back to 0 and then change the base UV on that one part, you'll see now that it scales up all the other parts in order to align there. So we do want to keep these at the same base UV size. And I'm going to go and then try to get those to line up as well as I can around that seam. Not an exact science and not going to be perfect, but we can say good enough. And here's a good enough. I'm going to select apply. And now you can see that our mesh is flowing along our helix here. So once we have our mesh set up, we could then remove that and apply a texture map and see how that will then flow. Remembering that we've got to change that UV for our texture map on that projection, and then we can zoom in and see how well it aligns. And again, it's not perfect, but I'm not seeing the stretching as much as I thought I would after that. We'll increase the size. You may notice that seam showing up, and that's because I'm going over to the UV size here and changing it, but we can then hide it as well or adjust it. I do like using our mesh. Could also look at a brush, see how that flows. And you can see here the brush is rotated, but if we want to change the flow of the brush, we can go to the angle UV and change that to like 90. And now you can see it again flows down across our model there. So general guidelines, when we come to the tessellation settings and controlling how it appears, I think this is really key, no pun intended, to utilize in here to make things easier for yourself. Imagine if we didn't have that direction guide. You'll remember I'm going in there and rotating those particular parts, and it can be a little cumbersome at times. Let's go back to our mesh. And the idea is, we want everything to flow. And that tessellation going in there is going to help us do that and help us see where those problem areas could be. And even here you can see I didn't scale it up very high, but now we can hide that. So I mentioned before, maybe we should have placed a guide there. But they really are there to follow the natural flow of the model's geometry. And there's going to be those times where you don't even need to add a seam. Maybe you've got a part that you've looked at the field chart and it just needs to have a guide placed in there. There's often challenging geometry involved, and I didn't come up with this list here. I actually utilized ChatGPT, and ChatGPT let me know that these particular shapes were challenging. And I agree for the most part, with the exception of the cylinder. I do think the cylinder is likely one of the easiest shapes to work with. Spheres, cones, torus, I'm going to agree with ChatGPT there and say that, yes, those are likely the most challenging ones there. But I have gone through and wanted to provide examples of ways that you could perhaps unwrap these particular shapes inside of KeyShot. So we've got a few examples here. Cylinder, really easy, but a great demonstration. You go over to the cone here, and you'll want to, again, we're adding that seam on that flat part, and then we're just thinking about that cone being unwrapped. So you'd really want to place it like this. You want to have that one seam on the side, and you want to have your direction guide there. Now, creating a seam for a sphere, we're looking at having your equator as a seam. So we've got these two parts split, and then placing a pole seam here. We can think of these as poles on the sphere, and we want to connect those two. So we have two parts that will end up unwrapping. And it unwraps well, but what you've got to be aware of is when we are creating a texture for a sphere, the sphere needs to be, or the texture needs to be wrapped for the sphere. We can't use just a rectangular texture. There's a option, an offset inside of Photoshop. It's called distort and spherical. And from there, you can change your flat rectangular 2D texture to a spherical so it wraps properly. Go over creating seams for a torus. You're going to want to have the seam that separates it. So if you imagine we've cut the torus and stretched it out into a pipe or a cylinder shape. We're also going to want to cut it through the center like we did previously on the helix. And then we've got this interior here. Now the torus themselves, they can be fairly difficult to unwrap, and you can see some odd stretching inside there. So as I mentioned before, hiding these seams is best, and don't feel like you have to be symmetrical with the seams. You could place this other seam down lower inside there. Really, that's it in a nutshell. I'm hoping that everyone has a bunch of questions to ask.
Yeah, please, if you guys have questions, feel free to shoot them over into the chat box, and I'll start pulling them off right here. I think Don, that was awesome. Yeah, you went in there and solved my problems at least, so hopefully you solved everybody else's as well.
Yeah, again, I just want everyone to really take away that it's not going to be perfect. There are things that we can do to maybe hide those imperfections, but there are going to be some shapes, like a cylinder, for example, is going to be really easy to unwrap. And I would recommend everybody just get in there, get comfortable with it, play with it. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the course, I wasn't real excited about UV unwrapping, but now I just kind of go in and get a little excited at some of the ideas of shapes that maybe come across my desk, and I'm like, I wonder if I can UV unwrap that. Um, to that note, I tried unwrapping a sphere this morning in hopes that I could demonstrate that today, but it was pretty bad failure, and I just don't want to embarrass myself.
I know Matt Gerard made a comment over here, looking for some more challenging shapes. Have you played a lot with more organic shapes? I know the sphere, the torus, and everything, but combining those shapes tends to get a little complicated, and obviously, it's a little difficult without having the CAD to be able to show it. But I don't know if you have any tips on using more organic or compound shapes when you're working with UV unwrapping.
Yeah, so great question. Oftentimes, like in our example right here, where we've got the two ends and then we have the center piece, right? And we've separated those. So if this were a complicated shape, I would separate those parts that were flat and then go to the center part, or whichever part wasn't flat, the more organic shape. And we can go in, and again, we can UV unwrap this in the same way, but we don't have to place the amount of seams. It's not saying you don't have to put the seams there. In some cases, I do, but really we only need to have that one seam and the direction guide. So I can select that, go in here, complete that, and then we'll go unwrap it. We should have those same settings as before, which was like 0.1, and then we did 90. And so when I would have a complicated model, let's say it's like this, I'd go and unwrap those all separately. And then what we can do is there's a new feature inside of KeyShot. I'm just going to make it a little bit better. There we go. Oh, ruined it. There we go. Terrible. All right. So new feature in KeyShot, it's a little bit hidden. So imagine we've split this apart, but we want it to retain that same material. We can select those parts, go up to our tools, geometry tools, and we're going to select mesh simplification. So imagine you have your CAD or your model. It's all split apart. You've reapplied or you've unwrapped all of the UVs, and you want it to keep that same texture. Going into the mesh simplification, we are not simplifying it. Okay, don't simplify it. Look all the way down here where it says merge parts. We're going to do that. We're going to select the merge parts. It's going to say it's going to mess up your stuff. Just ignore that. And then select apply. And then it's warning that there's some NURBS there because we created this from a NURBS. We're all good. So I'll select continue. And now we've got a solid, and the UVs are unwrapped, and they are all sharing the same material. So if you had a very complicated surface, I'd go in there, find your flat surfaces, separate those, and if you needed to, even separate your complicated surface into area surfaces or geometry that's more manageable to deal with. And then you can go and utilize the mesh simplification to merge your model back together. I know how important it is for everyone. We want to just have one part in there. So hopefully that kind of answers it. We could do maybe a follow-up of more advanced and really hard UV unwrapping, but that might make me cry a little bit.
I think that would be an idea, though. Maybe not the crying part, but
Right.
not to get you to multitask here. But a quick question:
Yeah.
if you unwrap your geometry and then you update that geometry in a CAD software, like if you're using live linking, are you going to have to redo that unwrapping once you update, or is it going to automatically kind of adjust for it?
Yeah, you're gonna wanna redo the mapping. The reason being is the CAD or NURBS, whether you have a solid or just surfaces, CAD software and the models do not contain UVs. That's why we're unwrapping them here. When we first import those parts, uh, they do appear to have UVs, but they're not really unwrapped. So that's why we run through this. You can't use the live linking uh, to go back and then apply the UVs to your CAD. So yeah, pretty much every time you update your CAD and then bring it in, you would then have to UV unwrap it again. There may be times though, in this case, where maybe this is such a high quality model, we don't want it to be that large. We can then go and actually use the mesh simplification there and just turn it down a little bit, simplify, and it should keep your UVs really well. So you can always like turn it up and then simplify it and knock it down, and it will keep your UVs. So that's one way of optimizing stuff there. There's a little bit of stretching. So be aware if you do that, just to look around and find those areas that may be issues and maybe reason to run that unwrap again.
Oh, Oliver's
Are there
got
any other questions?
Yeah, Oliver's got a good question here. When you're using UV unwrap, sometimes the surface ends up white. He's basically asking, what's the main reason for that surface to end up white? And then if
Uh,
it does fail, what are the best steps to finding a solution?
Yeah, so that's going to be more of a direction guide thing. And so let's see if we can do that real fast. And we'll all select the part, go to tools, unwrap UVs. So um, yeah, I'm sure if you just select this and go to unwrap, there we go. So you didn't denote where the seams were, didn't tell it any directions. It comes in like this. Other times you may set it up proper and add your seams in, let's say, and then select that part. And we'll try this one more time, see if it happens. Yeah, so now we've got this weird purple thing. If we scale it down, notice how when we have that base UV at 0, it's white. So oftentimes if you get this, then you're going to want to say clear, and that will take you back to the previous screen. And then look at places where maybe you need to add some more seams in there. And then notice how it didn't complete all the way because I didn't select the third one. So there we go. And we'll see if we can get that white chart to show up by not connecting all this. And there's one more end down at the bottom. I'm not going to select it. And it because I didn't have the seam added, so you guys can see where it's pulling. And notice how the base UV, it says 0. This is keeping the last settings that were there. This is not actually 0. So you got to update it and then you'll see the actual size. We put it back to 0, then it's white. And because I'm trying to create that artifact with the white, it's obviously not showing up unless I turn it down. So best practice would be add a direction guide in there, or try to look at your seams proper. Once I started messing with this and knowing, oh, that's the other thing, is keeping in mind, I'll clear this here. When we talked about the direction guides, going in the same direction. So if I select there and go to left to right and apply it, but then I come over here and add another guide and I'm going, uh, wait, got to clear it. Yeah, that's right. Go here. We're going in a different direction there. So you'll see some oddities, and there it is. So in this example, it's because our guides were not going in the same direction. This one was going left to right, and so is that one, depending on how you look at it. Clear.
Here's a question for you. In
Yeah.
the modeling stage, what should we be considering if we're going to UV unwrap our model once we get into KeyShot? Is there anything we should
Oh yeah.
take into account?
Yeah, depending on what you're modeling with, and what I mean by that is your software. For example, Maya, if you're modeling with NURBS, you'd want to start in a clockwise direction. So imagine, let's see if we can take a step back here. If you're looking at a cube, or say you're just going to model a cube and you're using edges there. When I say going in a clockwise direction, the U is your width and your V is the height. Okay, so if you're modeling a NURBS cube and you want your UVs to lay out well, you're going to start here. There's your U, and then there's your V. Here's your other U, and there's your V. So if you think about just working in a clockwise direction as you build your surfaces, it should give you decent UVs. Oftentimes, using a sweep will work well. If you've got, a curve and a circle, but it really depends on the CAD software itself. But the one tip I would give is, if you're modeling in Maya, just go in a clockwise direction. And even Maya's tools, when you put down that first CV, you'll see, I think it's in the shape of a U, and your last vertice or connection point is going to be in the shape of a V. So it actually gives you some cues there on modeling.
We got a couple questions that came about filleted edges. How would you approach unwrapping something
Uh,
filleted edge, or even scarier, a contour?
yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna have to think of those as being separate parts. So, if this had a nice round and then a flat piece, we would want to separate that round, treat it as if it were a here. It's not easy. I'll just say that, because it's going to be dependent on how you split it up. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm doing it freestyle here, guys. So please don't judge. I'm gonna take this rounded sphere right here. Say okay. And just as we did before, let's take a look at the retessellate. So I'll tessellate it there, and we can look at it now. And just as with the helix, I'm looking at the part here. So we want to take that flat piece, right, on the flat part. Then we have that flat part. And if we imagine the side of the cylinder as being unwrapped, then we would have a pretty decent unwrap. But taking in consideration of the round there can be difficult. So I'm going to select apply, done. And this would be a shape that I would probably go in, use the tools, split object surfaces, and then select the top and the bottom flat parts there. And we can split those as one. We didn't have to do it as separate parts. And then we'll go ahead and I would UV map those first, and we can just use the unwrap shell, go into a top view, just kind of turn it a little bit. Remember to select your part there. I'll be about 2. good enough, select apply. And then I would select the side, right click on there, go unwrap UVs, and then add that seam with a direction guide. So I'm going to go starting from the bottom. Let's look just to be sure that we got a connection. Great. Start from the bottom. And, I mentioned skipping that second one. We could also go up here and wait for it to complete and then select that part and we're done. And this is one of those moments where you cross your fingers, right? So I'd select that, go unwrap, and oh my gosh, it worked.
Success.
Yeah. So then, just kind of sizing it up there, select apply, and then let's see how it looks. May have to go back and adjust the top and bottom, but let's see how it worked out. Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Probably come in there and mess with that a little bit more, but just for the sake of time, I'm gonna call it. But, the less parts you have, uh, the easier it will be to unwrap. You may be tempted to go in there and maybe split the parts differently. Maybe you wanted to have the top parts with the round. I wouldn't suggest that because it's so easy to take those top surfaces there and then just do a quick unwrap on them, right? Think about how you can lay out the part there into a rectangle is really how I would approach it. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Don.
Yeah.
I know we started kind of talking about this a little bit ago. I'm going to bring it up one more time just because a bunch of people are asking about the UV maps. Is there, you don't need to show us, but is there a workflow for being able to get the UV map from KeyShot out so that somebody can work with it in Photoshop, like exporting a model and having that information?
Yeah, yeah. Totally as I mentioned before, and then lost my files. If we save that out, uh, you'll see that with the USDs, oh, that's why. Let me take a step back and we'll do a GLB. So the USDZ file format will zip everything up. GLB um, will not. Let me create a new folder so I can find it this time. So we got the GLB there. Go in and cylinder, save that. And so it's even asking, do you want to keep the UVs? What do you want your textures to be? Select preferred textures, so it will keep that. And select export. I'm going to go over to my GLB file that we've got. Give it a moment. Oh, and we can't do that with a procedural. So I would need to actually assign a texture for that to work. Hopefully that doesn't derail the question too much. So if you have your texture already on there, you grab a color map. Actually, a bump. Set that to UV, and then now we can export as a GLB. When we bring it in, you can see there is the texture, and I didn't render it in a really high resolution. You can double check that, and then I'll open that up. You can see it's right there. So it does save it out. I've got another example of where it saved out as well from a different file that we were working on yesterday. And the shape was quite different. And this one actually, I'll open that up. And so you can see, here's another example when saving out the GLBs. This one also had I guess that was a normal associated with it. So yeah, that would be the example there. So we're gonna find another one. So here's another example of how the cylinder comes out, that texture as well. So you can definitely export it. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. All
Yeah.
right. Yeah, so that's about all the time we have today. I just wanted to remind everyone one last time about scheduling in-person training with Don. If you are interested in having him come out and host training for your team, don't hesitate to reach out. I believe you're also doing digital training now, like virtual training. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, yeah. We do virtual and on-site, and then in Chicago, we're doing the workshop there, animation workshop, which should be fun, and it's live as well. So
Awesome. Yeah, so definitely reach out if you guys want some training for your team. Every now and then we'll have training at our KeyShot Worlds or in person at our headquarters here in Costa Mesa as well. So keep on the lookout for any announcements for that. If not, reach out to Don. We'll also have this webinar up on our YouTube early next week. So if you missed anything or you want to reference something in particular, keep on the lookout for that as well as any other upcoming quick tips and tutorials we have coming out. And on that note, I really appreciate all of you guys taking the time to be with us today. And Don, do you have
yeah,
any closing thoughts, comments?
yeah. Thanks all for watching, and I hope that this demystifies the UV unwrap and helps make you comfortable at least getting in there and trying it. And remember, this isn't about perfection. So just get in there and get a feel for it, and feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. Be happy to answer those. So thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. All right. Cheers, everyone. We'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you.